The basic triads are major, minor, diminished, and augmented triads, also known as the major, minor, diminished, and augmented chords. Triads are chords that consist of 3 notes: a root, third, and fifth. The root is the bottom note from which the chord is built. For example, C. The third is placed a third interval above the root, and the fifth is placed a fifth interval above the root. There are different sizes of third and fifth intervals. These different sizes of intervals creates different types or qualities of triads. All chords have chord symbols above the staff. The chord symbol tells you which chord is contained in the measure. There are 2 components to chord symbols: the chord root and the chord suffix or description. A triad can be in any of 3 inversions. It is in root position when the notes are stacked by third intervals. So right now, all 4 triads are in root position, but triads can also be in first or second inversion. This will change the order of the notes so that the root of the triad is no longer the lowest note on the staff. This will also result in different internal intervals. I will go through each chord and show you its different inversions and internal intervals. All chords can be analyzed to determine the intervals present in the chord. It's especially important to learn and memorize the intervals present in root position triads. From this point, it's easy to turn the chord into first and second inversion. Let's start with the major triad. Root position triads always consist of successive third intervals on the staff. The lowest note is the root, the middle note is the third, and the highest note is the fifth. From the root up to the third, there is a major third interval, and from the third up to the fifth, there is a minor third interval. So we have a minor third interval on top of a major third interval. A perfect fifth interval is created from the root to the fifth of the chord. Keep this in mind even though it has not been written. To get the next inversion, we move the lowest note an octave higher, while the other notes stay in place. Now, we have a perfect fourth interval on top of a minor third interval. The internal fourth interval of first and second inversion triads is always from the fifth up to the root. Now the lowest note is the third, the middle note is the fifth, and the highest note is the root. This order of notes applies to all first inversion triads. Again, to get to the second inversion, we move the lowest note an octave higher, while the other notes stay in place. Now, we have a major third interval on top of a perfect fourth interval. The lowest note is the fifth, the middle note is the root, and the highest note is the third. Again, this order of notes applies to all second inversion triads. When moving the lowest note an octave higher, we get to a root position triad an octave higher. So any triad can be in any of 3 inversions: root position, first inversion, or second inversion. It's important to realize that these internal intervals applies to all major triads, not just this particular C major triad. Notice the internal intervals of a minor triad in root position. From the root up to the third, there is a minor third interval, and from the third up to the fifth, there is a major third. Again, there's a perfect fifth interval from the root up to the fifth of the chord. In first inversion, we have a perfect fourth interval on top of a major third interval. In second inversion, we have a minor third interval on top of a perfect fourth interval. Notice the internal intervals of a diminished triad in root position. We have two minor third intervals. This creates a diminished fifth interval from the lowest to the highest note. In first inversion, we have an augmented fourth interval on top of a minor third interval. In second inversion, we have a minor third interval on top of an augmented fourth interval. Notice the internal intervals of an augmented triad in root position. From the root up to the third, there is a major third interval, and from the third up to the fifth, there is also a major third. This creates an augmented fifth interval from the lowest to the highest note. In first inversion, we have a diminished fourth interval on top of a major third interval. In second inversion, we have a major third interval on top of a diminished fourth interval. It's important to at least learn and memorize the internal intervals of these basic triad qualities in root position. Then, you can easily build each triad quality from any root note and move back and forth between the different inversions by moving the lowest note an octave up to get to the next inversion, or by moving the highest note an octave down to get to the previous inversion. Now, I will mark the root of the triad in each inversion. The root is always the lowest note in a root position triad. It is always the highest note in a first inversion triad, and it is always the middle note in a second inversion triad. This applies to any type of triad. Another important thing to notice is that the root is always the lowest note in a root position triad, the third is always the lowest note in a first inversion triad, and the fifth is always the lowest note in a second inversion triad. Again, this applies to any type of triad. Let's build each triad quality in root position. Mastering this, and you will be able to build any of these four triad qualities from any root note. From there, it's easy to turn them into first and second inversion using the method just described. In this interval chart, you can see the number of half steps required to create all intervals up to an octave. This is vital knowledge when you want to build triads or larger chords from any starting note. In this context, we will only deal with the marked intervals. Notice the number of half steps regarding these intervals. We will build the triads from the root note F, so the four chords will be F major, F minor, F diminished, and F augmented. The type of the two stacked internal third intervals will determine the type or quality of chord. The fifth interval is the result of the two stacked internal third intervals. We know the required type of internal third intervals for each triad quality in root position. So we just need to create these internal intervals from the new root F. When counting the number of half steps, we count up from the bottom note. For example, from the note F to the note F sharp is a half step. This equals a minor second interval. Let's build the F major triad. We need a major third interval from the root up to the third. In the interval chart, we saw that a major third interval is made up of 4 half steps. So let's count 4 half steps starting from the root note of F. We land on the note A, so from F to A is a major third interval. Next, we need a minor third interval from the third up to the fifth. A minor third interval is made up of 3 half steps. we land on the note C, so from A to C is a minor third interval. Let's add the interval from the root to the fifth of the chord. This is a perfect fifth. A perfect fifth interval is created by 7 half steps. 4 half steps plus 3 half steps equals 7 half steps. To build a minor triad, we need a minor third interval from the root up to the third. This gives us A flat as the third of the chord. It's important to use the note name A flat and not G sharp. This is because the interval number is found by counting up from the bottom note, starting at 1. So the interval number from F to G is only 2, and as root position triads are constructed by stacked third intervals, we need an interval number of 3. So we need to use the note name of A. From here, we need a major third interval up to the fifth of the chord. And so we get the note C as the fifth of the F minor chord. Again, there's a perfect fifth interval from the root up to the fifth of the chord. In comparison to the major triad, the third interval is flatted. Now, we have a major third interval on top of a minor third interval. The number of half steps from the root up to the third is 3, and the number of half steps from the third up to the fifth is 4. Again, this creates a perfect fifth interval from the root up to the fifth of the chord. To build a diminished triad, we need a minor third interval from the root up to the third. This gives us A flat as the third of the chord. From here, we need a minor third interval up to the fifth of the chord. And so we get the note C flat as the fifth of an F diminished chord. Now, there's only 6 half steps from the root up to the fifth of the chord. This equals a diminished fifth interval. In comparison to the major triad, the third and fifth intervals are flatted. Now we have 2 minor third intervals. The number of half steps from the root up to the third is 3, and the number of half steps from the third up to the fifth is 3. This creates a diminished fifth interval from the root up to the fifth of the chord. To build an augmented triad, we need a major third interval from the root up to the third. This gives us A as the third of the chord. From here, we need a major third interval up to the fifth of the chord. And so we get the note C sharp as the fifth of an F augmented chord. Now, there's 8 half steps from the root up to the fifth of the chord. This equals an augmented fifth interval. The number of half steps from the root up to the third is 4, and the number of half steps from the third up to the fifth is 4. This creates an augmented fifth interval from the root up to the fifth of the chord. Let's play the 4 triads in root position to hear the distinct sound of each triad type or quality. The major triad sounds happy. The minor triad sounds sad. The diminished triad sounds really sad because of the 2 minor third intervals. And finally, the augmented triad sounds dreamy because of the 2 major third intervals. The major and minor triads, or chords, are the most commonly used. You may sometimes encounter alternative chord symbols for the same chord qualities. That is, the suffix is different. I prefer to use the chord symbols used so far for the major and minor chords. However, the major and minor chord symbols might be notated with alternative suffixes like this. I'm not keen on these alternatives as the note name with no suffix is the correct way to write a major triad chord symbol, and the suffix mi already indicates a minor triad. Another common and perfectly correct way to write the diminished triad is to use a small circle as the suffix for the chord. The small circle is similar to a degree sign and is appended to the top right of the chord symbol note name. This is actually the most practical way to write the diminished chord symbol, as the Roman numeral used to signify a diminished triad also uses a small circle as its suffix. More on this in the next video on diatonic triads. Though, I like the dim suffix as it is easy to translate into a diminished triad. But it's important to know that the diminished triad suffix is often a small circle instead of the dim suffix. Another common and perfectly correct way to write the augmented chord symbol is to use the suffix plus. Again, when using Roman numerals, the plus suffix is used to represent an augmented triad. Though, I like the aug suffix as it is easy to translate into an augmented triad, but it's important to know that the augmented triad suffix is often a plus instead of the aug suffix. I hope you liked the video. In the next video, we will look at diatonic triads.